Pauline Bonaparte lay on marble, unveiled like a goddess, confident in her power over body, desires, and men. She had herself sculpted as Venus, revealing neither pose nor meaning. Napoleon's sister, brilliant and inconvenient, she broke the rules that governed all of Europe. Pauline sought no forgiveness and played no part in modesty. She allowed herself what others were forbidden and paid no price in shame. Her freedom provoked, attracted, shocked. But who truly hid behind the mask of seduction? Why did Napoleon tolerate all that she did? And how far was she prepared to go in passion, in scandal, in power over men? To understand how this disobedience took root in her, one must go back to a hot Corsican childhood, where it all began with the anticipation of a brother and the first glances that held no sin, yet already concealed a challenge. It was there that the Pauline who would later be wished forgotten, erased, slandered, and still remembered, began to form. The year Marie Pauline Bonaparte was born in Corsica, the island had already been definitively incorporated into France. But the air there was still different, bitter, resinous, rebellious. The people born among these rocks and cypresses breathed not Paris, but the ashes of old freedom, where family honor meant more than law, and upbringing resembled military drill more than gentle lessons in societal decorum. Pauline was born in June 1780, the 8th child of the Bonaparte family. There was already a boy in the house, the elder brother Napoleon, destined to become the ruler of half of Europe, and several sisters, less prominent in history, but raised in the same spirit, strictly, Catholically, under the burden of needing to be worthy of their father's name. But for Marie Pauline, everything unfolded differently from the start. She was born in the absence of her brother, who was already in France, taking his first steps up the military ladder. They met only 9 years later, when Napoleon came to Corsica on a brief leave. This meeting, as contemporaries later recounted, seemed to awaken something instinctive, kindred, and at the same time more complex in them. They were drawn to each other. Glances, smiles, a tender detachment that would later be spun into rumors that their bond was more than just kinship. But there was no more truth left than reflections in the mirrors of others' conjectures. Besides, Pauline was 9 at the time, and childhood affection can be stronger than any love.
She grew up amidst strict habits, yet seemed to not notice them. Pauline was the one who chose lightness from childhood, even when life offered hardship. She was not interested in books, did not gravitate towards art, did not ask unnecessary questions, but she could laugh so that adults lost the thread of their reasoning and the maids gasped and crossed themselves. A mixture of ancient eros and natural cheerfulness seemed to reside in her. A young nymph in a house where everything was calculated for discipline and propriety. And this was not rebellion. She simply didn't fit. A quiet resistance expressed not in protest, but in detachment. There was no defiance in her gaze, but an inexplicable freedom. The surviving portraits from those years show how rapidly her beauty blossomed. Her face as if carved from fine porcelain, with a slight shadow of irony on her lips. Her eyes surprisingly alive, dark, capable of laughing and piercing with a single movement. Her body supple, graceful, without deliberate ostentation, but with that innate self-awareness that distinguishes those who know from infancy they will be watched. Her beauty was not theatrical, but alive. She did not need makeup did not try to please, but pleased everyone who knew how to see. And yet, the main mystery was not where such a light and independent nature came from a family with a strict code of honor. The main mystery was why no one could change her, not her mother, not the nuns, not the guards in the Parisian house. Pauline seemed to live in her own temperature. Even her name in the documents, Marie Paulette, was barely used. She was Pauline, resonant, ringing, southern. A light name that rolled through salons, was whispered in alleyways, passed from mouth to mouth like something delightfully improper. She entered adolescence, knowing no limits, but surrounded by increasingly persistent glances. Men, especially the officers at Napoleon's headquarters, quickly noticed their commander's sister. Soon, rumors began to spread that there was no one among these men who had not tried to be close to Pauline. It seemed as if the entire army, the entire future empire, was already being built in service to her charms. And she accepted this with a carefree confidence in her power, which perhaps she herself did not fully understand. She was simply like that. That's how she grew. That's how she lived. But behind the outward lightness, shadows began to gather. Pauline's maturation took place against the backdrop of turbulent events in Europe, family instability, and her brother's rapidly advancing career. The world around demanded seriousness, obedience, strategy. But she, as if to spite it, continued to smile, flirt, and coquette, oblivious to how her freedom was becoming a source of headaches for the entire dynasty. Pauline did not yet know how many times they would try to tame her, marry her off, correct her through marriage or upbringing. But even then, it was clear she belonged neither to her home, nor her brother, nor her island. She was herself, and this made her dangerous.
When Pauline reached the age where a girl ceases to be a child but is not yet a woman, her beauty acquired an almost frightening completeness. It was something more than a successful combination of features. There was an energy in her that compelled one to look, not to avert one's gaze, not to calm down. Even the portraits that have reached us centuries later breathe not canonical spirituality, but something alive, carnal, almost physically palpable. This girl did not ask for attention. She was its embodiment. She had fine, precise facial features in which pride and disobedience could be discerned. A high forehead, a soft curve of the lips, a straight nose, eyes with a slightly mocking slant, features in which one could unexpectedly notice a resemblance to Napoleon. Not to the portraits in uniform, not to marble busts, but to that living, dangerous man who once shook the world. They were bound not only by kinship. Their appearances, strangely, mirrored each other. He, a masculine child of war, she, the feminine shadow of the same strength, but turned inward, into charm, into the body, into feeling. It was her body that became her main instrument, even when she didn't realize it. Pauline moved lightly, as if dancing even in her chambers. Her gait, her way of holding her head, tilting her neck, everything spoke of a natural grace that was never learned. No one taught her to seduce, let alone to command. But she didn't need mentors. There was no affectation or affectation in her. Everything that usually serves as a weapon for women, she seemed to carry with her from birth, like a soft light around her figure. It was not a style, but a substance. Not a pose, but nature. However, in the eyes of those around her, especially men, Pauline's beauty quickly began to transform into a myth, a dangerous symbol, an excuse for their own weaknesses, and while they admired and yielded, she benefited. Unconsciously or intentionally, it is difficult to say. But every touch of her hand, every glance, every turn of her head acted as an invitation to desire, even if she was just passing by. She was compared to ancient goddesses, but not to Athena, too cold and rational, but to Venus, sensual, soft, uncontrollable. She did not want to be intelligent, and this irritated women. She did not strive to be worthy, and this frightened men. Pauline was never fond of literature, did not strive for intellectual conversations, and showed no interest in music or science. She could spend hours looking at herself in the mirror, not because she was narcissistic in the academic sense. She was simply curious about what others saw. She lived outside of ideas, outside of analysis, outside of strategy. And in this lay her danger, because she perceived the world instinctively like a living being, following not logic, but impulse. She sensed who wanted her, who envied her, who lied, who was afraid, and responded not with words, but with a choice: to stay, to leave, to smile, to turn away.
Some would call her foolish, vulgar, and superficial. But history has no right to judge solely by IQ. Her strength wasn't in intellect, but in influence. And influence, as we know, requires no proof. In her circle, there were dozens, then hundreds of men. Some sought an ideal in her, others solace. Some a way to gain something. But more often than not, it all ended the same way. They left disappointed, not because she teased them, but because they invented who she was supposed to be. By the age of 16, Pauline was perceived not as a young lady, but as an almost mythical figure. In Parisian circles, it was well known. If she entered a room, it was an event. Even without education, manners, or a refined accent, she sparked jealousy in sophisticated women and astonishment in men accustomed to the cynical games of salons. She couldn't be ignored, and this angered those used to earning attention through knowledge, status, or position. Pauline simply entered, and the world around her reorganized.
Of course, this effect was not long-lasting. The energy of beauty eventually requires either transformation or reckoning. But while she shone irrevocably. There was no desire to be the best in her appearance. There was only an inner permission to be herself. And no matter how much the educated part of society resisted it, it was precisely in this, in absolute, unconscious freedom, that her challenge to the era lay. When a woman becomes an object of desire too early, society usually does not spare her. It first plays along, laughs, provokes, and then greedily pounces on the prey, brands, and destroys. It was exactly like this with Pauline. She had not yet emerged from adolescence, and in men's eyes she had already ceased to be a girl. In the garrisons of Napoleon's army, her name was spoken with almost reverence. Some claimed to have been with her, some hoped, some envied. Among the young officers, tales spread, each more vivid than the last. It was said that the entire officer staff of the emperor, without exaggeration, had been among her favorites. These stories were believed because people wanted to believe them, because imagining Pauline without an erotic halo was already impossible. She herself apparently did not perceive what was happening as reprehensible. In her consciousness, there was no strict moral division between the permitted and the forbidden. Men were beautiful. They desired her. Why not respond? Why not try? She lived in her body, and her body was her measure of the world. She did not play at seduction. She existed in it, as in her natural environment. For others, it was depravity. For her, breath, light, pulsating, incomprehensible. But an empire, like any hierarchy of power, does not tolerate uncontrolled variables, and Pauline was becoming precisely such a variable. The higher Napoleon rose, the more dangerous his sister's antics became for him. The emperor could not allow the name of his lineage to be associated with scandal, debauchery, or ill repute. Although he, of course, knew Pauline better than anyone else, he understood that she could not be corrected. She could only be curbed, directed, tamed, even temporarily. And then a seemingly logical solution arose in his mind: marriage. There was nothing sentimental about this decision. Napoleon did not seek love, support, or happiness for his sister. He was looking for a reliable lock for a restless soul, a man who could become a wall between Pauline and the world. And the choice fell on Colonel Charles Leclerc, a young, noble, promising officer close to Napoleon, had every chance of a high career. Moreover, he was handsome, educated, with a calm disposition. It seemed such a man could balance Pauline's fire, or at least not be consumed by it too quickly. And surprisingly, she fell in love, in the simplest, almost naive sense of the word. It was not sexual attraction, not political calculation, not a game. Pauline genuinely ignited with a true, almost girlish feeling for Leclerc. Her ardor, her unpredictable soul, suddenly found focus for a moment. She married him with a feeling rare in her life: inner consent. A son was born, the only child she was destined to have. She was a tender mother, an attentive wife. Everything seemed possible, even correction. But miracles do not last long. Soon the same element that had once submitted took its toll again. Pauline continued to meet other men. Her love for Leclerc did not disappear, but it ceased to be exclusive. She did not change. She simply returned to herself. And if before such behavior was only a hint, now it became open. She no longer tried to hide, neither from her husband, nor from her family, nor from the court. No door seemed forbidden to her, no meeting unacceptable. During the consulate, such openness was provocative even for the liberal part of society. The era still lived by double standards. Men could do much, women had to be silent, especially women from a family to which the attention of all Europe would soon be drawn. Napoleon was furious. His anger was not so much moral as strategic. His sister was destroying his image. She threatened the legend he was painstakingly creating, a legend of purity, order, a higher purpose. Pauline was the opposite of all this. She did not believe in purpose, did not love order, and did not consider purity a virtue.
Within the family circle, she became the subject of constant discussions, reproaches, and attempts at intervention. But every attempt to extinguish this fire only fanned it more. She remained the center of attention, the epicenter of gossip, the orbit of male passions. Some admired her courage, some despised her, but no one was indifferent. Pauline was a woman who was not forgiven what was usually praised in men: freedom. And then Napoleon made a decision that would change her life. He would send her away, far from the court, from Paris, from prying eyes. He would give her the opportunity to be a wife, a mother, a subject, away from the center of the empire. Thus began a new chapter, where exoticism would replace luxury, and tropical humidity the scent of French balls. But would Pauline's fire die out far from the world where she reigned? We will soon find out. At the beginning of 1800, Pauline Bonaparte, officially Madame Leclerc, stepped onto the deck of a ship bound for the West Indies. She resisted to the last. She threw hysterics, pleaded, staged scenes, flatly refused to leave Paris. This was not the whim of a society lady. It was the purest resistance of a nature that was being bent to external order. She did not want to become an appendage to a military mission, did not intend to play the role of a decorative wife in a tropical garrison. But Napoleon's will was absolute. The emperor insisted. The sister was literally put on the ship by force, like a restless child who had been forgiven too much. Formally, the trip had political meaning. The French expedition was heading to Saint-Domingue, a colony gripped by rebellion. Local black slaves, inspired by the revolution and the thirst for freedom, were rising up. Leclerc, appointed commander-in-chief, was to quell the mutiny and restore metropolitan authority. Pauline, from the perspective of political circles, was to demonstrate civilized French presence, to personify harmony, refinement, and a supposedly peaceful mission. But everything went differently. The hot, humid climate, the scents of the tropics, the tense atmosphere between the army and the population, all of this had a completely different effect on Pauline. Instead of fading, she flourished. The absence of courtly control, the remoteness from imperial proprieties, the feeling of impunity, all of this became a new arena of freedom for her. For the first time in a long time, she felt not like an object of surveillance, but the center of her own world. Here, far from Paris, she could forget about glances, instructions, and the Bonaparte surname.
She began to host parties, receptions, bowls, with a luxury that seemed absurd in a semi-military zone. Against the backdrop of constant conflicts, epidemics, shortages of medicines and food, Pauline appeared in silk and jewels, surrounded by music and light. French officers, exhausted by service, gravitated towards her like a mirage, and she readily accepted their interest. But not only theirs. It was said that Pauline also had affairs with representatives of the local population, and openly, without pretense. She seemed to deliberately challenge all who expected propriety from her. Her lightness turned into scandal, her body into a weapon, her freedom into danger. And yet, she was not cruel, not cunning. She simply lived as she knew how. And in this lay the tragedy of Leclerc, her husband. He still loved her, truly. He did not humiliate her, did not order her around, did not lock her in her chambers. He tried to be there despite everything. His mission in Saint-Domingue became increasingly difficult. Negotiations with the rebel leader, Toussaint Louverture, reached a deadlock, and the army was dwindling. And Pauline, meanwhile, continued to host private evenings bordering on orgies, neglecting even the semblance of propriety. For her, this was not an act of mockery towards her husband, but an escape from death. She felt the threat gathering around her. The yellow fever epidemic, which was about to engulf the entire island, was already hanging in the air. People began to die, silently, quickly, without fanfare. And when the disease reached Leclerc, Pauline, perhaps for the first time, realized that everything could end. She did not leave him. She sat at his head, cared for him, held his hand. Without drama, without scenes, she was simply there. In those days, there was not a drop of that fatal seductress about whom they gossiped on the mainland, only silence, pain, and fear. When he passed away, Pauline cut off her hair and covered her husband's body with it, a gesture worthy of an ancient myth. Many called this act theatrical, perhaps, but there was more love in it than in all the series of fleeting infatuations that surrounded her. At that moment, she seemed to realize for the first time that life is not just a game, or perhaps she realized that the game was over. After Leclerc's death, the island became unbearable. The French began to evacuate urgently, fearing the epidemic. Pauline left the West Indies, and the road home was no longer the leisurely stroll she was accustomed to. She was returning as a widow. And although her beauty remained with her, something inside had broken. Her son was with her, still alive then, small, fair-haired. And perhaps during those weeks she felt for the first time that her life was not infinite, that even she was not beyond the law of pain. But peace, alas, was not destined for her. Soon after arriving in Europe, she would once again find herself in the center of attention, and again, not for virtue.
After returning to Europe, Pauline did not just return, she reasserted herself. As if nothing had happened, as if the tropical drama, the death of her husband, the epidemic, and the fear had left no crack on her. Paris greeted her with the same delight, in which admiration was invariably intertwined with condemnation. She was a widow, young, brilliant, free. That is, from the perspective of high society, doubly dangerous. There were no boundaries anymore, not even formal ones, and she took advantage of it. Not because she wanted revenge, oblivion, or a new beginning. She simply couldn't do otherwise. Pauline's return meant the return of the myth. She again became a magnet for young officers, politicians, poets, diplomats. They themselves came to her, stood in the antechambers, adjusted themselves to a random smile, a random gesture. Her widowhood, unexpectedly, made her even more desirable. In that era, it was considered that a widow was a woman who had already known passion and lost her illusions, that is, experienced. And if a widow is also young, charming, and surrounded by a halo of legends, it became an almost mystical combination. But not everyone was happy. Napoleon flared up again. He could not forgive that his sister, a hero's widow, just a few weeks after the funeral, had again become the object of erotic attention for the entire capital. He was irritated not only by her disobedience, but also by the fact that she did not need him. He was emperor, ruler of Europe, and she behaved as if her freedom was higher than his crown. Nevertheless, he again tried to take control of the situation. He decided to marry her off for the second time, perhaps hoping that maturity, status, a new union could tame her, or at least distract her. This time, the choice fell on Camillo Borghese, a young Italian prince, a representative of an ancient and respected family. The prince was handsome, noble, rich, and unfortunately, in love. Pauline, as in her first marriage, agreed not out of fear or calculation, but because she felt interest. Borghese was fascinated by her. She, flattered. The union was concluded quickly. The wedding was magnificent. Pauline received a new title, new apartments, new status, everything except a new life. Her husband adored her. He showered her with jewelry, portraits, outfits, but his main gesture was commissioning a sculpture. He hired the outstanding master of the era, Antonio Canova,
and commissioned him to immortalize his wife. The idea was banal, to portray Pauline as a goddess. Initially, Artemis, the symbol of virginity, hunting, and purity. But when the sculptor voiced this concept, Pauline only laughed. Artemis? No way. If one must choose, then Venus, the goddess of love, body, desire. It was in this image, with an exposed torso, half reclining on a couch, that she was immortalized.
The statue still evokes admiration. Canova managed to convey not only physical beauty, but also something elusive, confidence, cold power, a game in which the viewer cannot understand who is the victim and who is the hunter. The statue is placed on a rotating pedestal, so it can be viewed from all sides, like Pauline herself, impossible to grasp from a single angle. Every turn, a new facet. But neither art, nor title, nor husband changed her nature. Within a couple of years of the wedding, she again surrounded herself with admirers. Her debauchery became even more open than before her marriage. The prince endured for a long time, more than 3 years. Then he offered a compromise, separate living with generous maintenance. Pauline accepted the offer with indifferent gratitude. Money, freedom, and new horizons, that's what she needed. Passion? It entered her life again in the form of a new hero, Niccolò Paganini. Paganini was a famous violinist, eccentric, emaciated, demonically attractive. He was called obsessed, cursed, devilish. He was a perfect fit for Pauline, as a partner, as an image, as a reflection of her own inner contrasts. Their romance became a feast of loneliness, of two free people who had escaped morality and meaning. Pauline did not play at love. She simply accepted what came, lived in the moment, even if that moment was destructive. By then, she was 30, but it had no effect on her. No wrinkles, no fatigue, only more inner detachment. Her only son, whom she had given birth to in her first marriage, passed away in the same year, 1804, when Napoleon became emperor. The loss was a real blow to her, not a showy, not a theatrical one, a real one. Perhaps it was after this tragedy that illusions finally disappeared from her life. She no longer waited for happiness, for peace, or for reward for her feelings. Only beauty, only pulse, only a living touch. But clouds were already gathering on the horizon. Her brother, elevated to a star, would begin his fall. And in this fall, Pauline would play an unexpected, almost mythical role, the last faithful one, the last one to stay by his side. Against the backdrop of imperial fanfare and endless victories, the Bonaparte family appeared as a new dynasty of gods. Each brother received a title, each sister was endowed with status. Pauline, a princess, a muse, a hero's widow, a prince's wife. She shone at court, not obeying its etiquette. Her outfits were condemned, her behavior discussed, but no one could deprive her of the most important thing, closeness to Napoleon himself. She was not just his sister, she was his weakness, his mirror, but in a feminine reflection. He forgave her what he forgave no one else. He condescended, he closed his eyes. He convinced himself that he could control the storm, even if it was brewing from within his own home.
But everything changed the moment a tectonic shift occurred in the emperor's personal life. Napoleon divorced Josephine, a woman who, by many accounts, was his true love.
The divorce, dictated not by feelings but by political strategy, became a painful symbol. For power, he was ready to abandon even the past. Maria Louisa, Archduchess of Austria, young, cold, distant from the Corsican bloodline, replaced Josephine. This marriage was meant to solidify the empire, to make Bonaparte an equal to the Habsburgs, to erase his low origins. Pauline perceived this union as a personal betrayal. In her eyes, he betrayed not only Josephine, but the very idea of family. She knew how deeply Napoleon was attached to his first wife. She knew it was not calculation, but pain. And in this pain, he renounced his heart for the sake of the crown. For Pauline, this became a breaking point. For the first time, a real wall arose between them. Not just irritation, not disappointment, alienation. They ceased to trust each other. Napoleon no longer sought openness with her, and she did not strive to comfort him. From then on, their relationship became formal. He continued to provide for her, to respect her formally, but the warmth, the weakness, the strange, almost mystical connection that had seemed unbreakable disappeared. Pauline, having lost her son and brother, not physically but essentially, began to slowly distance herself from the world. Her passions became muted, her outings infrequent. She was more and more often alone, even if formally surrounded by people. In the letters that have reached us, there are few feelings, but many pauses. Pauses. That's what became the main language of her end. And then the collapse came. The empire, which Napoleon tried to make eternal, began to crumble. Coalitions grew, armies weakened, opponents gained strength. In 1814, the emperor abdicated. He was exiled to the island of Elba. And here, when almost everyone had turned away from him, Pauline did what not even he expected. She sold her property, her jewels, left all her social circle, and went to him. Without hesitation, without whims, without looking back. The sister, accused of egoism and profligacy, turned out to be the only one who came when everything had fallen apart. She cared for him, as she had once cared for the dying Leclerc. Only now the pain was different, not physical, but imperial. He was losing not his health, but the world he had created with his own hands. Pauline tried to brighten his exile. She organized small evenings, brought books, kept conversations going. She did not reproach him. She did not talk about Marie-Louise. She did not return to the past. She was simply there. In this, her entire understanding of love, without conditions, without agreements, beside him, even if it was the end.
And then the impossible happened. Napoleon escaped from Elba, returned to France, and the famous 100 days began. Pauline helped prepare the escape, participated in the organization, relayed letters. She did not believe in victory, but she believed in her brother. It was their last joint gamble, the final act. And when he lost again, they didn't let her near him anymore. She was not allowed to the island of St. Helena, where Napoleon spent the rest of his life. Politics, fear, British caution, they all decided that witnesses to his past should not be near the exile. Pauline remained in Rome, strong but broken, like the empire itself, which she perhaps understood better than anyone because she lived on its reverse side, not on the throne,
but in the corridors, not in the halls of fame, but in rooms where passion and loneliness combine for a solitary meal. She did not ask for a meeting. She did not beg. She understood everything without words, and she began to wait. Rome, where she moved after her brother's exile, did not greet Pauline with particular enthusiasm. Here, no one needed a scandalous beauty from a fallen dynasty. But she herself was no longer seeking attention. Her stay in the eternal city became a strange calm after the storm of her life, like ash scattered over still warm embers. Pope Pius VII, a politically subtle and humanly wise man, offered her refuge, not out of sympathy, but out of understanding. Even fallen lions need shade. She settled in a spacious but not opulent villa, overlooking the domes, cypresses, and the sun slowly flowing down the slopes. It was a different world, without balls, without poets, without intrigues. She was surrounded by servants, rare visitors, a silence that had become almost physiological. She no longer hosted noisy evenings, did not change clothes 5 times a day. Her dresses became simpler, her hair a little darker, her gaze more attentive. She did not try to hide her age, although outwardly she changed little, but the timbre of her presence became different, not passionate, focused.
Little was said about her health, but in whispers. Perhaps the consequences of a past illness in the West Indies, or internal wear and tear, or something else. She was tormented by pain, unpredictable, hidden, the kind that is not spoken aloud. Sometimes she disappeared from salons for a long time, and then reappeared, with a faint smile and unfeigned weariness on her face. In those moments, even her enemies admitted she was no longer playing, she was real. Stripped of pose, stripped of mask, Pauline, whom they didn't allow to be herself, was now simply being it. With Prince Borghese, her second husband, she reconciled quietly, almost routinely. Without stormy scenes, without resuming relations, just 2 people who had outlived each other. He visited sometimes, briefly, politely, and between them reigned not enmity, but the even weariness of people who had not had to be happy, but also had not had to destroy each other completely. The last months of Pauline's life passed in semi-seclusion. She rarely went out, almost never received guests. Sometimes on Sundays she visited church, the very one where she would eventually remain forever. Santa Maria Maggiore, a space full of shadow, gold and whispers, in which her name sounded quieter and quieter. In 1825 she passed away. The cause remained unclear. Cancer, some said. An infection she contracted in the tropics, others said. Some claimed she simply stopped fighting, that her life, built on flashes, faded not in drama, but in silence. She was 44, the age at which fairy tales end and chronicles begin. She was buried with honors, but without triumph, without crowds, without acclamations. The time of empires was gone, the time of passions also. Of her brilliance remained marble sculptures, pages of memoirs, dusty archives, and quiet fame. But perhaps it was in this silence that her victory lay. Her name was crossed out of official textbooks, but not from human memory, because those like her are not forgotten. They are whispered about, they are feared, they are admired. Pauline Bonaparte, a woman whom history tried to reduce to an anecdote,
But she was much more. She was a challenge, the flesh of time, the shadow of an empire, love and pain transformed into a legend. And if there is at least one question left in this story, it is not to her, but to us. What do we do with women who do not live by the rules?